Welcome to Living 4D with Paul Chek. Today's guest is the founder and co-director of the sanctuary at Sedona, Dean Taraborelli. Dean's pioneering work in developing the sanctuary's integrative addictive recovery program has been used to help hundreds of clients to successfully treat addiction. Dean is a member of the senior teaching staff for the Four Winds Society and author of Be Recovered, Transformational Healing Through Integrative Addictive Recovery. He has traveled to sacred sites in over 60 countries to study world mythology, religion, spirituality, wisdom traditions, and indigenous healing and wellness practices. Stay tuned to the end of the podcast to learn how you can get a free copy of Dean's book.
So welcome to Living 4D with Paul Chek. Today I'm interviewing a very interesting man that I'm excited to share with you, Dean Taraborelli. I trip on your name, Dean, but thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me. And again, thanks for all the work that you're doing in the world.
You too. I would share that I do a lot of work with people with addictions. I think it's pretty much impossible not to work with people that have addictions when you work in any kind of therapeutic practice and start looking into, beliefs, behaviors, habits, and the way people expend their energy. And I was a couple of years ago, I was working with a client whose wife was having a pretty serious problem with alcohol addiction. And he asked me if I could help him find a treatment center. So I started doing research on treatment centers, and Penny also put a bunch of them in front of me. And I narrowed it down to the sanctuary at Sedona. But at that time, I didn't realize you were involved in it. And I forwarded that information, and I've saved it and given it to various people and mentioned it to my students in various classes. And one of my students and friends, Patricia Garza Pinto, emailed me one day and said, "You really need to interview Dean Taraborelli from the sanctuary." And I thought, well, that was a synchronicity right there.
Yeah.
So when you responded to Penny and shared an interest in the interview, I started doing more research into the sanctuary, and I watched a number of videos and read some things, and I really tried to pick up a sense of what you guys are doing there. And I really loved it. And so I'm excited to talk to you about a variety of the issues that are related to that, and with the intention of doing our best to help people. So I'm wondering if we could start off by having you share some of your own history with addiction. I watched some of your videos and got a bit of a synopsis, but it seems to me that your path into the work you're doing was the hard road.
Yeah. And, I think that I probably began my addiction just like anybody else. And when I was a young man, I began smoking marijuana, and I liked it. And I didn't think really much of it, but I wound up developing a pretty good habit early on. And, I was smoking marijuana, I don't know, 5, 6, 10 times a day, at age 12, 13 years old. And
that's an early start. Yeah.
Yeah, that was an early start. And the kids in my neighborhood were older than me. So I just began the process, and it became sort of a little bit of an identity. It gave me something to do. It gave me sort of I felt a little bit awkward. I realized, back in the day that I never felt really well adjusted or like I fit in. It's just an average little kid. But anyway, that then led to in my late teens, I started drinking, and that then began a pretty heavy process. And at the height of that, wound up drinking one of those half-gallon bottles of vodka every day. And that's what led me to treatment the first time. And so I wind up in a treatment center, and they say to me, "You know what? You're an alcoholic and an addict." And I thought, okay, hold on. Let me think about that for a second. I'm not stupid. I'm moderately intelligent. So it's not that I can't understand that this is not good for me, but I can't seem to stop. I'm not crazy. I can function in the world. So it's not that I'm too crazy to understand that this is an issue, So the only thing that made sense to me was, yes, in fact, I'm an addict. So I took it on. I became Mr., the quintessential addict, going to all these meetings, and I was in all these groups, and I wanted to get well. So I just immersed myself in what was presented to me, which is kind of the 12-step model. This is what you do. And so that became, hey, an identity. Now all of a sudden I have a context to put this thing in that made sense, And this went on for about 4 or 5 years until I relapsed. And, Paul, you've been around and you know what addicts do when they relapse. They hit it hard, right? Because that's what you do.
Yeah.
And so, this whole then treatment cycle continues. And then I develop some more clean time, and eventually I get some pills, and that leads to this fairly substantial opiate addiction that at the height of that, I was taking 100 Percocet every day. I was getting them from the VA hospital, taking a whole bunch of benzos to go to bed at night. And I didn't realize the trouble I was getting myself into until I couldn't get them one day. And,
wow.
I'm not stupid, so I knew something was going to give eventually, but I didn't understand the magnitude of what was going on. And that then led to this very debilitating heroin habit. And to the things that happened during this process, I went to rapid opiate detox a couple of times, and it didn't look like it does now. Rapid opiate detox was a little cruder back then. And finally one day, I was, had naltrexone implanted in my body, and I couldn't, opiates, all my receptor sites were occupied. So I started smoking crack because I just couldn't stand the detox. And so this whole thing spread out over about 30 years. I was in treatment for about 20 of those years. And every year I go to treatment centers. So I've been to some of the best treatment centers that money can buy. And I paid very close attention in them. I wanted to get well. Hey, I have people that love me. I have a career that's going pretty well. I have, everything seems to be going well in my life except for this particular aspect, which actually was most of my life. 90% of my life force went to either trying to stop getting high or trying to find more drugs to get high. And that was my life. And I wanted to get well. And during that time when traditional treatment wasn't working, I began the process of looking around the world. So I've been to 50 countries, at least. If I heard of a shaman or a mystic or a cleric or a doctor or a teacher somewhere in some remote part of the world, I get on an airplane to go over to see them because I really wanted to get well. And so my addiction was a pretty furious thing. If I started to share all my war stories, I could write a book the size of War and Peace, full with all the drama that goes along with it. I've been clinically dead a couple of times. I've overdosed in the dozens of times, hospitalized and blah, blah, blah. So it's been quite a journey for me. And that's what my addiction story looks like.
Yeah, it's one that I've seen quite a number of times in my own career, and it's not nearly as uncommon as a lot of people listening might think. I'm curious, what was your career? What were you doing for work?
I was in manufacturing, and one of the things that I think some of your listeners will probably resonate. So I had this business going. I worked with my brother, and we had a small factory that went, and so I became a really good manager. So while in my addictive process, hey, I've got my job and my income. I got to take care of that. I've got my family that they're going to worry about me, and I don't want them to stop me. So I have to kind of manage them. If the police ever catch me with this amount of drugs, it's going to be really hard to convince them that this is just for my own personal consumption. So I have to worry about them. I've got my health going on, so I have to manage that. I've got my recovery that I'm trying to go, so I'm trying to manage that. So I've got all of these things going, and nobody really knew until kind of the bitter end of this thing, because I was so good at navigating and getting through the day. So I'm willing to bet that a lot of people fall into that category. We protect our wounds, we protect our addictions. We just want to. The one thing the human does is we try to stay in the status quo because that's safe or comfortable. So we get good at navigating that. And so I was an outstanding manager. So nobody knew what was going on in my life during this whole time. And, it's exhausting trying to manage one of those aspects, let alone all of them.
Yeah. In my work, I actually have a course I sell online called the 1, 2, 3 for overcoming addiction, obesity, and disease. It's the 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's based on a model I developed. One, love. What do you love enough to change for? I often quote psychologist Jerry Wesh, who says, if you have a big enough dream, you don't need a crisis. So the first step is finding out something that you love more than what's limiting you or challenging you. 2 is there's only 2 forces that create everything in the universe, the female yin and the male yang. So I look at people's lives and where they're balancing, how well they're balancing those creative forces within the context of the 4 doctors. 3 is choices. There's only 3 choices we can make in relationship to any person, place, or thing. The optimal, which is best for everybody involved. The suboptimal, which is usually that which gives us some form of instant gratification, but causes problems on our dream team, which is whoever's working with us to create safety and security and accomplish our goals in life. And then the third choice is do nothing, which has 2 expressions. Do nothing can mean I need to take a time out because maybe a conversation's getting heated and we're losing connection with each other, or do nothing means I don't have enough information, so I need to get more information before I can make an informed decision. And the most painful one is indifference, to just not care. So it's, what do you love enough to change for? Where are you out of balance? What choices are you willing to make in regard to balancing your life with regard to creating happiness, Dr. Happy, moving your body effectively, Dr. Movement, getting enough rest, Dr. Quiet, and eating in ways that are supportive of your body's individual needs. And what I found is that most people that have addictions have some kind of trauma in their life or a series of traumas that they haven't been able to resolve, and they're actually looking for safe love. And I found, the example I often give is a bottle never complains about how you kiss it, or a cigarette doesn't complain about how you put it in your mouth, or, you can get this sense of either an alleviation of your stress, fear, or pain, or a sense of connection, or you can make yourself unconscious, but let go of the conscious thoughts by drowning yourself with heroin or whatever drug it is. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts with regard to addictions as a means of finding safe love? And how much trauma was there in your early life that may have led you to looking for safe love?
Yeah, excellent point of view there. I think if we kind of look at sort of the basic drivers of human behavior down at its most rudimentary form, what do? We seek pleasure and we avoid pain. And many people go into addiction not because they're in pain. We don't perceive, gosh, I'm so in pain, because this all resides unconsciously. So 95% of what's going on in all of our brains is unconscious. So I'm not aware of what's driving my behavior on a conscious level most of the time until I begin to do the work of being recovered. But so most people begin the process of getting high because it makes them feel good. And, I can dance better, or I have courage to talk to a member of the opposite sex, or, to tell my boss to jump off a bridge, whatever. And we have to stop and ask the question, well, what is it about my belief system or the way that I feel about myself that I need to be intoxicated in order to, say, kind of release my inhibitions? Why can't I dance better just because I'm uninhibited and I go out there and dance the way as if nobody was looking? So we have to that then begins this process of how do we feel about ourselves and how do we feel about the world around us? So ultimately, you had mentioned the word connection. Connection is a soul thing. It's part of what makes us human. We are tribal in nature. So this whole kind of lone wolf competition, all the things that we may have been taught are actually not true. The most successful cultures on the planet have been cooperative. We are used to being part of something. Being part of is important to the human experience. So when people don't feel that, then they're going to look for something. So most likely they're looking for this connection. Where people, in my opinion, that are getting high, they're looking for something. They're just looking in a way that's going to ultimately become unsustainable. And
Yeah.
And so I'm right there with you. In my own, I will share with you, and I think this is pretty well agreed upon now. There is always a cause for addiction. It's sometimes people just say, "Well, I'm an addict, and that's just part of my DNA." Well, hey, just because something runs in the family doesn't mean it's predetermined. For one thing, now we have epigenetics, which means that my genetic expression can change over time based on my external stimulus. So this whole thing that I just wound up an addict is probably a fairly an older model and the way to look at it. So it's either a physical or an emotional thing that's the driver for addiction. And when I say physical, you mentioned balance and imbalance, particularly in the gut. You mentioned one of the doctors is Dr. Diet. Well, we know now that Dr. Diet is really important for people with anxiety and depression because inflammation is the precursor to anxiety and depression. We used to think it happens concurrently, it's a co-occurring disorder, but actually it happens upstream. So there could be something in the body that is creating distress. And of course, that it doesn't send a signal up saying, gosh, my gut is, distressed. What it will send a signal into my brain that just says, I'm not okay. So now I've got this underlying feeling that I'm not okay. So it's sort of like a little fire. I got to try to put that out, and nothing like a cocktail or a Xanax to do that, or a Big Mac or a big deal or any of the number of addictions that people can have. So it's either that or it's some unprocessed emotional wound. And what's interesting, our conscious mind, I barely remember much of anything that happens. I don't remember what I had for dinner last night or the night before or any number of things unless it's emotionally charged. That's how we remember things. The higher its emotional signature, the more likely we are to remember it. But my unconscious mind remembers everything. So all my unprocessed stuff, and for me, I had this very debilitating addiction, but I had no real memory of any trauma, Paul. This is the interesting thing. And that just made me feel worse about it. Like I would go to treatment with all these people that had stories of how they were hurt and wounded and abused. And I didn't have any of that. And I thought, gosh, what's wrong with me? And actually, it was only last year that I remembered something that happened to me when I was in first grade. And that changed my direction in my life. And I had zero recollection of it until a year ago. And so this is where really, our psyche wants to process this stuff out. And what happens is that it's not what happens to us, Paul. It's all the decisions we make, all the coping strategies, all the ways that we will then navigate in the world that come back to haunt us later.
Hi, this is Paul Chek, and I am super excited to share an amazing line of super nutritional products that I found called Organifi, Organifi. If you go to Organifi.com and check out their product line, they have a wide variety of excellent products. And unlike any food-based product company that's ever showed interest in sponsoring the Czech Institute or any of my courses or products or videos or any of the projects I've done that stated they were organic, when I asked them for their organic certification, I never got them. I have been through this before. When I contacted Organifi and asked to see their documentation that they were legitimately using organic source materials, very quickly I got an email with 14 organic certifications showing that their source materials are certified organic.
Then I put the products to the test with my family and on my own body, and I must say I was very impressed. They have a wide variety. They have green juice, red juice. They have a product called Gold that aids with sleep, muscle aches and pains, and joint stiffness. It helps bolster your immunity. It's awesome. One of my favorites is called Pure, and it's got lion's mane. It's baobab infused. It's great for gut health, brain performance. Lion's mane is excellent for stimulating neurogenesis. I love to give it to my son Mana. Another one that's fantastic is Immunity, which is an organic superfood product, and it supports your immune system. It tastes fantastic. I like to put these right in some water and mix them in and drink them, or put them into tea. They have a variety of great stuff like green juices, red juice. They have Organifi Gold. It aids with restless sleep, muscle aches and pains, stiff joints, bolsters your immunity. You'll wake up feeling rejuvenated if you have that in the evening. They have awesome protein powders. Angie's about to give birth to our second child, and she's been really enjoying their protein powder. Their products are safe for pregnant mothers. I'm a very picky guy, and I'm hard to impress when it comes to food products, but these guys really got me. I love the products. If you are ready to try some amazing products that can really make your life more efficient, if you don't have time to do a lot of cooking, you're a busy executive, or you're a mother and you've got lots going on and you need something to give your kids now and then that's legitimately nutritious, good for them, and organic, which means clean and high in nutrients, you can't go wrong with Organifi. Go to Organifi, Organifi.com, and when you're checking out, put in Chek 20, lowercase c, lowercase h, lowercase e, lowercase k, 20, and you will get a 20% off at checkout, and you will be amazed, just like I was. Can't wait to hear your feedback. Check them out, Organifi.com. When you're checking out, use the code CHEK20 for a 20% discount, and prepare to be nourished, enlivened, and amazed. I'd love to hear your feedback.
Yeah, there's a few things I would share in regard to what you've just shared. One, the enteric nervous system is the solar plexus. It's the part of our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, that regulates our digestive eliminative function and is what innervates and creates the sensory function inside our digestive tract. And most people aren't aware that the enteric nervous system has a bidirectional relationship with the sympathetic system, the parasympathetic system, the endocrine system, the somatic or peripheral system, the musculoskeletal system, and our limbic system. So whenever we're eating things or emoting in ways that trigger inflammation, it causes regulation of all the key bodily systems, and it responds as though we're under stress. So people start dropping into stress behaviors without even realizing, for example, that it's things that they're putting into their body that are triggering that inflammation, but it can also be our own mental emotional self-management system, which, as you mentioned it in your own way, is largely unconscious. So this is one of the reasons I have a 4-doctor approach, because I found that if you're missing one of those doctors, there's the it's like having a house and leaving a door open at night and wondering why when you wake up in the morning all your furniture's gone. You can't live a balanced life without awareness of those 4 doctors.
You bet. It's so interesting. We talk about the body, the mind, the soul, and the spirit, and these things are all intimately connected. Just like, as you're saying, the organs in our bodies are all connected. If we look at the vagus nerve that's connecting, everything is connected to everything. And this is the universe that actually we live in. We're all connected energetically inside my body. All of my organs are connected to my nervous system, et cetera. This thing And this is why functional medicine is becoming so popular, because it's a field of science that takes into account the interconnectedness of all the systems in the body and how they communicate with each other. And this becomes imperative in terms of our well-being. So I think that, and if we're going to talk about drug addiction or mental health, ultimately we have to talk about well-being and balance. And when we are out of balance, then something's going to give. It's just the nature of the universe. So,
well, I was just going to say that's very true. And I teach, when I show my 4-doctor system, I talk about how people are so freaked out now with all the genetic tests, and many people come to me saying, "Oh, I have the fat gene or I have the cancer gene, ... And they of course think that they're doomed to that future. And I tell them a chain is only as strong as the weakest link. And now that you know that you have a weak link there, you should be inspired to be conscious of and manage your own happiness, your own diet, your own rest, and your own need for movement, because those things fortify the chain of being. And if you ignore any one of those, the first place that the chain is going to break is exactly where your genes have informed you. So you can either use that to scare the hell out of yourself, or you can use that to inspire yourself.
I like where you're going there. If we look at, now we've been looking at epigenetics for a long time, and giving talks about it way back when. Epigenetics basically means that, hey, I got my genome from my parents on the night of conception, and that is in fact my genome, and it is what it is. But whether those genes express or not, they're like switches. Whether the switches is in an off or on place has a lot to do with my environment. So what is my environment? That's everything that I think, everything that I eat, every place that I hang out, my friends that I'm hanging out with, music that I listen to, all the stimuli that comes into my experience, body, mind, soul, energy, is either upregulating my genes, meaning I'm getting younger, healthier, or it's downregulating my genes. So something that was really interesting for me, as I was looking at what to do, and I've thought about this problem. I mean, you can imagine how many man hours have gone into my recovery, and since now working at the sanctuary. And I thought, I was looking into the success rates. So AA has a success rate. It's between 5 and 10%. Treatment as a whole has a success rate about the same. It's probably closer to 5 than 10, but it's around in there somewhere. And then they have this thing, spontaneous remission. And spontaneous remission, that's where, hey, somebody just decides they're going to stop doing something, or they're going to get well, and they get well without doing anything. So I thought to myself, well, gee whiz, I can spend another $50,000 at treatment. I can go to AA and spend $1 a day and go through that process, or I can do nothing, and my chances are statistically the same. And I thought, okay, well, wait a second. Let's look into this spontaneous remission, because you look at people with stage 4 cancer. You look at people that the doctor comes into the hospital and says, well, you get your affairs in order. You got 3 to 6 months to live, or, you've heard the story. And then somehow these people go out and live another decade or two and have amazing lives, and they have this remission. And I thought, how can we not leave it up to spontaneity? How can we help to create this remission process? And that was the clue to recovery, and exactly what you're talking about. Hey, just because I have a predisposition to something doesn't mean that I'm a slave or a victim to it. It just means I got to pay more attention to that. That's the kind of the hand that I've been dealt, and everybody's got a different hand. So, you got to play the cards in the way that's going to be best for your body and your recovery.
Yeah, the way I teach epigenetics to my students and my patients, to make it really simple for them, as I say, you've all seen a genome and you know what genetic sequences are. So just imagine you turn a genome sideways and visualize it as the keyboard on a piano. Now, how you play that keyboard is going to determine whether you're making music or noise. If you pour a bunch of strawberry milkshakes and sugar in there, you're going to gum the keyboard up and you're going to have gene problems. If you beat on the keys with a hammer, treat yourself violently or act violently in relationships, you're going to find out which of those keys has a weak link in it, and you're going to end up paying the price. And I found that my students can really grasp that concept because, the piano is there, and just like the genes are on-off regulators, when you touch a key, it's on, and when you're not touching it, it's off. And as you just said, our environment and all the factors, of which are many, are playing those keys, but usually it's the choices we're making. And as you alluded to, most of those are unconscious choices, which is why I often quote Arnold Patton, who says, if you don't like what's happening in your life, look carefully at what you're choosing unconsciously. And I teach a concept called the pain teacher. I say, whenever pain shows up in your life, it's not wise to numb it or drug it unless you absolutely have to get through a crisis, such as an acute injury or an accident. It's best to be present with it and pay attention to what you're doing in your life that makes that pain worse. For example, if you keep drinking coffee and it's giving you a headache, well, the pain teacher is telling you to look carefully at your coffee consumption. But taking aspirin and continuing to drink coffee means you're still jamming the keyboard or hitting it with a hammer, so to speak.
It's so interesting. And I so agree with where you're going there. All of these things are messages. And when we can sit and get the message and the direction and act upon them, hey, that's what feedback is. If we look at our sensory nerve endings, hey, I live in Arizona and it's getting on summertime now. And so if I go outside without a shirt on, after a while, my skin is going to give me the message, hey, you better change your behavior or else you're going to be hurting. And so, but somehow when we get to an emotional thing, we are taught, I think culturally and everything else, to avoid emotional distress. And if we watch any advertising, any TV commercial is all about, wow, you don't feel good. Here, do this and take this, buy this, get this, buy a boat, all these different things. And basically the message says, hey, if emotions went from 0 to 10, 0 being total despair, 10 being ecstasy, hey, if I'm at 8.5 and below, I have to get rid of that. I just have to totally, it's not appropriate. And those are the messages we get. Even if you look at a mother and a child, the child's crying and the mother says, oh, don't cry. And meanwhile, the mother's just trying to placate the baby. But what the message that the mother's transmitting there is, don't feel. You should not be feeling that way. That's not appropriate. So don't feel that way. So we get a lot of signals that say how I'm feeling is not okay. And therefore people just try to do anything they can to not feel that way, rather than try to decode the underlying message, which is just like my external skin and tells me, hey, it's too cold outside, put on a coat, change your behavior. Well, my emotional information is that's my compass to navigate the world. Hey, if something feels good, I'm going to move towards it. That's what's right for me and my soul. If something doesn't feel good, that's something that I need to look at those things. And somehow, I think many of us have lost confidence in our deep sense of our own intuition and what's right and not right for us.
Well, absolutely. And using your analogy of the baby there, and I'm going to dive into some of this a little later on, so I'll get more into it with you then. But the child also interprets that it's not safe to express their feelings. So they repress their emotional expression because they're conditioned to realize that it's often more painful to express their feelings openly. And as I'm sure you know, feelings buried alive never die.
Yeah.
The other issue that you alluded to there is people being programmed by our culture and by the media and by the medical association to just, run to a doctor or a therapist and take a pill for almost anything. And what I teach my students, which I think is critical for anybody, including addicts, is that, the way we relate to ourselves in the world has a lot to do with the language we speak and what the words and the symbols mean, because that's how we make meaning. And in our culture, we use a treatment model. And if I say, Dean, I'm treating you to dinner tonight, who's paying?
You are, of course.
Yes. So when we go to a doctor or a therapist for treatment, we've got this linguistic based assumption that we're going to pay them money and they're going to take our pain away and our problems away, and we're going to get off the table and walk out and everything's going to be hunky-dory. But clearly that approach is not working. So I teach my students, we don't use a treatment model, we use a coaching model, and we don't do anything for the client that we can teach them to do for themselves, or we just become an opiate, a facilitator of the pathology. And I have a saying that I use that's the motto for my holistic lifestyle coaching program. We don't treat the disease that has the person. We coach the person that has acquired a disease, specifically to teach the students what it means to coach somebody to learn to be aware of and balance themselves and their lifestyle, or we're falling right back into the treatment model, which doesn't work very well unless you are in a head-on car accident and you need surgery.
You bet. I think, a couple of things about that. Well, I think that one of the complaints that I've heard about the 12-step model is, hey, I'm giving away my power. I'm powerless. I have no authority. I can't, I think that our model of helping people to be recovered is that I have to take responsibility. I'm exactly what you're talking about. It's me that nobody knows better for each person what's right for them on the planet than they do when they're in balance. But I think in terms of this personal responsibility, one of the things that we share here, and if we look at the medical model that we live in the United States in particular, which is a sickness model, not a healthcare model, it's a sickness model. We manage sickness or manage symptoms. There's a word, iatrogenesis, and iatrogenesis means death by medicine, and it's currently the third leading cause of death in the United States. And what that means is that, for all the listeners that may not know, that hey, I come down with problem A and I die of complication B. So a way we can understand that is staph infection. Hey, I go to the hospital to get my appendix out. I have to stay in there for a day or two for whatever. I develop staph. I think close to 40% of staph infection is now not treatable by antibiotics. I die. So that's an iatrogenic response. There's nobody at fault.
Yes.
There's no big, no negligence. The doctor didn't leave the scalpel. It's the system itself. So medicine is now the third leading cause of death. It's mostly side effects of medication that is causing that. And that's why people, once they get to a certain age, they're expected to be on 4 or 5 medications because, hey, I take a medication that has a side effect. Now I take a medication for that side effect. And that cascades into now in my own chemistry experiment. But, and so I think if medicine is the third leading cause of death in the United States, the days of walking into a doctor and doing exactly what you say, hey, fix me, and taking whatever the guy hands you or the woman hands you, I think those days need to be behind us now. Because
yes, they do.
And it's just and I think in defense of doctors, I just want to be clear. Look, medicine it's influenced heavily by the pharmaceutical industry. These people get called on by these reps. They come in with a lot of charts and graphs and signed by very prestigious institutions. And, it says, hey, if you have a patient that has these symptoms, give him this and you're helping him. So a doctor, a month later, a person walks in the door, has those symptoms, and the doctor says, wow, I know what to do about this. And I have all these heavy hitting signatures behind here. Here's all this proof that this stuff works. I'm actually helping this client by giving them this medication. And that's how this goes on. So there's no villain here. It's the system itself has gone so far out of balance as our culture has. And I think that's got a lot to do with the epidemic that we're facing right now with mental health and addiction as well.
Do you work in the health or fitness profession? What was your dream when you started? Did you want a career where you could really impact someone else's life in a profound way and the satisfaction of knowing that you do good and important work? When you watch your clients succeed, when you see them smash their PR, finally living pain-free or fitting into their dream wedding dress, did you feel that immense sense of being alive and rooted in your life's purpose? Our Chek trained professionals feel that sense, and they feel it often. And it's because they're mastering a powerful system of holistic health created by Paul Chek, a system that gives them deep insights into human health and performance and the tools to help their clients reach their goals like no other system. Now you can learn that system yourself through the Czech Academy, the most structured, comprehensive, and affordable way to complete the entire Chek system of training. The Czech Academy structures all of Paul's books, correspondence courses, and live advanced training programs into a digestible monthly learning program, enabling you to absorb every drop of knowledge while still maintaining your own business. Plus, you'll be supported by a mentor, get business training, and have an entire community of passionate Academy students on the same journey as you. That means you'll be able to implement everything you learn and grow your practice into a flourishing business that supports your dreams. It's all available to you starting now for an affordable monthly fee. Ready to apply? Visit us at czechacademy.com to get started. That's czechacademy.com. Now, back to Paul.
Yeah, I understand everything you're saying, and I believe there's certainly an element of truth to that. I also feel, and I've spent my entire career, I've been doing this work for 35 years, and a large percentage of it was spent working in a medical clinic with a surgical center and orthopedic surgeons, neurosurgeons, you name it. So I'm pretty well connected to. At one point, I had 36 physicians as patients myself that were seeing me and or sending me their family members, often both. So having kind of an inside view of the whole thing, one of the things I've always found challenging and frustrating is that the doctors themselves see the same issues over and over, not going away. But it's usually not until they're in a crisis that their own system can't handle that they actually start looking outside of their own box. So part of the challenge is that they suffer from, quite heavily programmed behavior themselves. And a good example of this is if you watch a number of documentaries on vaccination injuries, inevitably it won't take you long at all to find medical doctors whose own children were either killed or seriously debilitated by vaccinations. And only then did they start looking into whether or not what the AMA was telling them was true or what the CDC said was true. And I've seen several physicians in tears breaking down because they felt so lied to by the American Medical Association and the various corporations doing this kind of research. But my point is that the doctors are just like politicians and doctors are, they're a mirror of our culture, and they're made of our culture. And the same things that are keeping the doctors from advancing medicine by being caught in programming and just not paying attention to the fact that their own patients aren't healing is the same thing stopping everybody from healing from addictions or eating disorders or whatever it might be.
I agree with you. And this all boils down to our underlying beliefs, right? So these doctors, we're looking at the program. Hey, I'm watching TV. I'm seeing all these messages, and we say, God, someone would have figured this out. If this stuff is so toxic, somebody would have figured it out, right? I'm seeing all these, and that's an assumption that's based on. It's not based on anything other than conditioning. So I think that, it's so interesting when we look at the definition of insanity. So that comes into play in a lot of recovery, right? So it's insane. Hey, I keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. So we can assign that to the addict pretty easily, right? Hey, you got high again. Were you expecting anything different? Well, no. And but I think that has to apply to treatment as well. And I can't tell you how many times, another relapse, I walk in the door of a treatment center and I get handed my step one package again. Here it is, start over. do the same thing. And, eventually we have to start to wonder where the insanity is. And so the model that we have of sickness and symptom management, I think, is what we're all trying to change and realize that the human being is so much more powerful. And the technology of our bodies and the wisdom that is in every cell of our body has far more capacity than anybody at any of the pharmaceutical companies to manage well-being.
Yes. The reason I asked you about your childhood and if there was any traumas that might have been unresolved is, and I'll quote Jung. Jung says, all children are tasked with the unfinished lives of their parents. And in my work, I do a careful analysis of the father archetype, the mother archetype, the child archetype, the eternal child archetype, the victim, the saboteur, and the prostitute archetypes. And it's very rare that I don't hit pay dirt and find out where there's real challenges in the developmental period of childhood until a person typically leaves home. But an example of children being tasked with the unfinished lives of their parents, if a child announces to mom and dad that it wants to be an artist, and mom and dad are professionals, they might say, oh, no, you can't do that. You've got to go to school to get a degree as a lawyer or a doctor, or you might disgrace the family. Or if parents were too bottled up emotionally and didn't dance or didn't enjoy themselves, then the child is programmed with that model in order to fulfill the unfinished lives of the parents. In metaphor, it needs to learn to dance and express itself, or it's going to probably exemplify the same kind of genetic challenges that are in the family, or some sort of health problem or addiction that's in the family. And I'm curious, in your work, do you look into these developmental issues with people?
Oh, yeah. What's so interesting, this is all part of the human experience. Whatever our parents didn't work out, they're going to pass it along to their children. And and by the time that people leave the house, they're already programmed. So this happens at a very early age. If we look at where do children get their beliefs or their way of looking at the world, most of that happens by the time they're 8 years old, when they're in that kind of theta state. If you look at the reason why that is, if you think about all the rules of a family, let alone the greater community and then the world, it would take somebody a lifetime to learn all those rules if I had to sit down and read them in a book. So I watch my parents. I watch them. I'm being conditioned by them. I'm learning to please them. And all of their wounds are then being transmitted right to me. So this is when people say, and we've all heard somebody say, I will never grow up to be like my mother or father. And that's the invitation, 30 years later, who are I? I'm exactly like my father. And it's not like they have a change of heart. It's just that they've been programmed that way. So all of these unconscious patterns are handed down in the family. And we have to look at those because a lot of times we think it's just about us. Now we know there's all these studies that are out now that actually we pass memories down genetically. So not only experience, but we're also passing down memories. So we're getting a lot of stuff transmitted right to us that we have no control over until we can see it and develop it later. That these little snafus that come up become signals of that I have to start looking into these things and explore in a much deeper way than I think we've thought of it in the past.
Yeah, you used an interesting term, snafu. Do you know what it means?
I don't.
Situation normal, all fucked up. That's actually what it means if you look it up in a dictionary.
Nice.
One of the things that I've seen in my life, and it definitely does happen, I've run across a number of cases of this, whether it be cancer or any number of disease states or addictions, is that every now and then, I'd say probably 1 in 50 clients that I work with or patients, is that I won't find a significant enough amount of information when I look through all the things that we've been discussing. Someone may have a quite well managed, diet and lifestyle, or we'll call it 4 doctors. They don't have a lot of family trauma, but they're really caught in some kind of an addiction or disease process. And so what I've found, and this is my own take on it, I'm just curious what your opinion is that it's not unusual for a soul, that especially a soul that's fairly evolved, to choose a life path that is quite challenging, so they can, get an internship in what they're actually here to help people in the world resolve. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm in agreement with that, and I'm very oriented towards the soul. It's interesting in our work and in a lot of indigenous traditions. They talk about the soul and soul sickness as being kind of the primary thing that goes wrong. Soul. So when I think about my soul, this is my sort of deepest, truest, most authentic part of who I am. And I think that it's my belief that our souls have been around. I don't think this is my only experience of life. And I think that souls do come in with things that they need to learn, and we pick the clearest, fastest path. And so in my own life, I look at my own addiction as actually a wake-up call. It was something that was calling me forth, right? And it actually turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me, because it was the root of the sanctuary. It led me to my passion. And so I do think that souls incarnate with things to work out. I think that if people don't resonate with that, another way we can look at that is, hey, let's say that a person listening to this program doesn't believe in any of that. And hey, you just show up to life in this body and end in this body. But if life serves you lemons, you got to make some lemonade. And so, so we can look at it one way or there. I happen to think it's a much deeper, broader, more, I think it's more complex than just this one life. If we look at now, we see it a lot because of YouTube and those things. Look at these little kids that are piano virtuosos at age 5 and age 3. Where did this come from? They're either grabbing it from the field, or it's coming from a past life experience that they had. They're tapped into something broader than themselves. And I think that we all are, to some capacity, if we choose to embody that and start digging.
A lot of what ails people today is that they're programmed with this. If it's not measurable or weighable, it doesn't exist. And I've had many students with that mindset in my class, and I just have a very simple question for them. How important is love in your life? Well, I've never had a scientist or a left brain or a scientific materialist student that doesn't say it's very important. I say, is there anything more important? No. Well, isn't it interesting? You cannot weigh and measure that, but it's extremely real. And that usually helps knock a scientific materialist into a different dimension of perception.
Yeah, I like that analogy a lot. And it's so interesting if we just look at science, if we look at dark matter, whatever that is, we don't even know what it is, but it supposedly comprises, 85% of the known universe, and we can't even measure it. So
right.
85% of that's out there is unknown to us, and that's just in our own dimension, let alone other dimensions that might be happening. So I think if we get all bogged down into that which we can measure, then, we're really limiting ourselves. And again, people are looking for a more expansive experience in their lives. That's why I think most people go to drugs, is they're looking for more. They're looking for God. They're looking for a deeper connection. And so what's wild about, I'm much more interested in the quantum scientific world, because it's all about probability and the unexplainable, and that, wow, my thoughts, and I am part of this thing, and my thoughts and my actions actually affect those around me, and I'm affected by those that are around me too. And we realize the intricate connection that we have. Isn't that what all the religions are talking about? Isn't that what we're looking for? And so but somehow there's a disconnect intellectually when we try to intellectualize and contain something that can't be the unknowable. Somehow we limit it and lose our connection to it.
Yeah. Well, the nice thing about the quantum model is really the 0 point field is a field of potential or possibility. And people that are caught in sort of the left brain scientific materialist way of relating, which is the basis of our education systems, unfortunately, think that things like talking to your soul or connecting to plant spirits or nature spirits or any of those things are impossible. And I often quote a beautiful quote by Audrey Hepburn. She says, "Nothing's impossible. The word itself says, I'm possible."
Yeah. Well, all these things are just, things that we haven't quite figured out a mathematical formula to. So it's so interesting. You mentioned plant spirits. That's something I'm very connected to. If we look at, this substance called curare, which was a neurotoxin that they used in the medical field for a long time. I'm not sure if it's still used right now, but this has its origins in the jungle, and I think it's made of 9 or 10 different plants. And from my understanding, these plants, they gather them, and there's hundreds of thousands of plant species in the jungle, and I'm going to select these 10, and then I have to boil it for 72 hours. And if I smell the fumes during that time, that will cause this toxic effect, and the person will die. But after it's all done, this paste, you can actually eat it. But if you get it in your blood, you'll become paralyzed. And that's how these guys, like in the old Tarzan movies, when they shoot their darts, and the person just drops dead. Well, that's what they're using. And so I asked the question, well, how did they know how to do that? Because the chances of doing that through trial and error are statistically impossible.
Yeah, it's the same with ayahuasca and many of the plant medicines. I'm actually a Native American medicine man, spirit guide through the Native American Council myself, and have conducted approximately 400 healing ceremonies with plant medicine. So I'm pretty hip to exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of plant medicine. And ayahuasca, the same thing. I have the chicharuna and I have the ayahuasca. Out of hundreds of thousands of plants, here's one that has DMT, and here's one that has the MAO inhibitor, so your stomach doesn't destroy it. What are the chances of combining those two medicines and those two plants? And so you ask the shaman or the people, how did they do that? And they said, well, the plants told us. And,
yes.
And science rolls their eyes and okay, that's where the conversation ends. And, I would ask the question, well, then you tell me how they did it, because I don't see any other way. And so the intelligence of life and the intelligence of the field, all this information is in the field, and we're connected to that field. And this is something that is interesting in our recovery model. When we start to understand the energy body, and that's a very important part of what makes us us. It's also kind of my antenna to the greater field. And this is, when we talk about higher power, hey, we need a deeper connection to this field. That's our higher power. And I had been in many treatment centers where they would tell people that didn't really understand the concept of a higher power. They'd say, well, just make the group your higher power, or make the doorknob your higher power. And hey, man, if the doorknob's your higher power, you're in deep trouble, in my opinion. Because there's such an expanse out there that makes so many more things possible. And our connection, if we would just pay attention to it. The interesting thing is, because of our education and our conditioning, we don't have the neural networks for this thing. And I share in, one of the groups that we talk a lot about our energy body and our connection like this. Hey, everybody's got a middle toe, or most people have a middle toe on their left foot. I'm sitting here right now. I can bend my toes, so I know that middle toe works, but I can't bend it on its own. I can't move my middle toe independently of the other toes because I don't have the neural networks to do that. But if I spend time, I can learn how to do that, and that's what we have to do in terms of our connection to this greater field. We have to begin to pay attention to it so we can start to generate the neural networks in our brains so we can start to interact with it. And now that's when life starts to get pretty interesting, I think.
Yes, in my holistic lifestyle coach training program, level 3, the highest level, I teach my students how to connect to plants, trees, nature spirits, stones of different types. And often they ask me, well, how is it possible to talk to a plant or a tree? And what I explained to them, I said, if you look into genetics and pay close attention to the fact that what they call junk DNA actually turns out to be all the genes that we have in common with everything in the environment. We have something like 16% of the same genes as a daffodil and 23% of the same genes as a fly. If you actually look at what a human being is, we are the tip of the evolutionary sword. And what I tell them is what they call junk DNA just doesn't fit their model, but it's actually a history of everything that we've become on the way to being human. And since it is all life is an expression of the field, whenever we put our intention and our awareness on any living being or even a stone, then we're actually fusing our consciousness with that. And the genes that we have actually become the equivalent of going on Google and asking for a translation program. So if I'm talking to a tree and I just empty myself and I say to the tree, what are you good for? And all of a sudden what rises is a picture of somebody rubbing a painful elbow. And then I say to the tree, are you saying you're good for an acute injury, like smashing your elbow? And I get a yes. Then because I've emptied myself and I know that I'm not doing the thinking, I can perceive the images and the feelings and the messages that are arising and interact with the tree. But the point I'm making is medicine has this model that says we've got all this junk DNA. But as a shaman, I look inside myself and ask my own soul, what is the mechanism of translation? And that's what I'm taught through that interaction. And I think that if people just started looking at the research and seeing, we've got so many of the genes, we got 98% of the same genes as a chimpanzee. We've got so many of the same genes as mice. I mean, if you really look at it, we have the genetic means of communicating with almost anything. And I see the genes as antenna systems that basically act to pick up, to receive and send vibrational frequency. And that's everything that's in the universe is made of vibration.
Yeah, and I think we've been taught to shut all of these systems down. If we look at kind of the mechanistic world of Newtonian physics, and hey, that's what our medical model is based on. Sort of the parts of our body are kind of like a clock. Something goes wrong, I can just take out that gear, replace it, and hey, sew them back up and you're all set. And there's some value to that, of course, but it's missing the bigger picture of the interconnectedness, not only of our internals, but our connectedness to the greater field. And that's, again, that's what's influencing, in my opinion, when we look at what's some of the things that are going on. And if recovery doesn't talk about the state of our world today and as an influence, of course, it's unconscious, where people are typically so stressed out. I have a job, I have kids, I have mortgage, I have visa bill, I have, soccer game, all the things that they have to get to. But what's interesting is we, on a soul level, feel all that's going on in the world.
Yes, we do.
When another species becomes extinct, when we drop bombs on another nation, yes, I'm not aware of it because I'm so busy, but on a soul level, on an unconscious level, I feel that. And I think that so many people are trying to fit into a dysfunctional society. And I think being normal in a dysfunctional society is not necessarily a good reflection of what it's like to be healthy. So our culture is also out of balance. There's this as above, so below. This is true, and that's a reflection of the fractal nature of the universe. Hey, the universe is just repeating patterns of energy, and so are we. And so, all that's going on the micro is also happening in the macro, and vice versa. So I think people are influenced by the field much more than they have been taught. And once we start to understand that, and then I can start to moderate that relationship, I have more power than I ever thought that I could.
I agree. I think a lot of the issues with anxiety, depression, and the addiction that comes from trying to medicate them is exactly what you said. We're tapping into the collective unconscious, and we're aware of the genocide, the rape, the murder, the abuse, the violence, the all the stuff that we've been culturally conditioned to turn over to the state or to the government, so we don't have to worry about. But when we're going to the Middle East and pretending that we're going there to create peace, but we're really going there to steal oil and resources at a level below the conscious radar, we're all tapped into that. And I think it creates a huge amount of emotion in us that people don't consciously know where it's coming from. So they end up getting treated medically for what is actually something that we could resolve with spiritual practice, such as meditation and spending time in nature and learning to calm our minds. And I know that, I've been a regular practitioner of meditation, Tai Chi, and Qigong for a very long time. I was introduced to meditation at age 12 when my mother joined the Self-Realization Fellowship, which is Paramahansa Yogananda's teaching. And I've had many experiences where I felt deep, deep pain because I was tapping into the pain of humanity and the pain in nature. And I think that's what, our tribal systems gave us, a system of attenuation. You think of a wheel, it attenuates. If you take a bicycle wheel that has 32 spokes, if you hit a bump, it attenuates the force through the 32 spokes so that the load is shared. But with the breakdown of our family and tribal systems, we don't have a system of attenuating our stress. And as we become more and more divided as nations, then we break the wheel. And I think that we really at some point have to return back to seeing that the world is a medicine wheel, but we are the ones that are responsible for keeping the spokes balanced.
Yeah, that's a beautiful analogy, Paul. It really is. And, it's so interesting. We look at the young people that are coming into the world today. And, when you think about it, these young people think about the world that they're being born into. You can't eat the food's all toxic. I can't drink the water's all toxic. I can't breathe the air's all toxic. I am going to be strapped with debt that I'll never be able to pay off in my lifetime, that I had nothing to do with, that was actually taken from me fraudulently. All of these things, and then they start to kick up a fuss, and they'll be corrected and medicated, and you can imagine how painful that is. And when I don't have somebody to help me put that into context, I remember, some years ago we had a young man, and he was so angry. This guy was angry, and I would sit and talk with him, and I'd be, so what are you so angry about? Of course, when I have stress, I'm going to assign it. This is what we do. We assign it to something in my external world so I can avoid it and know how to manage it. So it's my parents, it's my this, it's my that. And when we actually sat down and talked about kind of the state of the world, all of a sudden he had a context for all of this unresolved emotion that he was having, and it made sense to him. All of a sudden he realized that he wasn't crazy, that he had that, like, how he was feeling was somehow validated. And all of a sudden that he was able to begin the process of changing perception. I like that expression that you used a little while ago in our conversation. And that's what our whole treatment philosophy is about. This is what the whole process of the sanctuary is about, is having a perceptual shift that I can begin to look at the world in a different way and not just manage my external circumstances, but actually be different. And when I can, what we look at, it's like, look at your life. Your life is the printout of whatever programs you've got running in your unconscious mind. So if you don't like something in the printout, we got to go to the program. And when we go to the program, then I can begin to change my belief systems, which will ultimately then affect my perception. And that's what we're looking for, is a perceptual shift.
Exactly. So, Dean, I see that there are many forms of addiction that entangle people's lives today, that range from addictions to drug, to work, to sex, pornography, anger, violence, video games, ideologies or isms, exercise addictions, power addictions, control addictions, avoidance addictions, fear-based thinking, money, stealing, adrenaline, and more. I'm wondering when you look at all these addictions, do you work with only drug addictions at the sanctuary, or what are you equipped to work with there?
Well, actually, all of it, Paul. What's interesting is that, and we say this to every person that comes here: what you're coming here for is not what you think you're coming here for, because these are all symptoms. So whether and many of those things that you actually just listed are condoned by our culture. If we look at work addiction, for example, hey, you work 16 hours a day, you're like you're respected in your community. Wow, look at Paul, man, he's really what a hardworking guy. They don't realize that you've got the same underlying avoidance issue as the heroin addict next door that's getting high for 16 hours a day that we keep our kids away from. So it's really what's underneath all of that. And so when we look at the drivers of our addiction or the root causes, that's what we're looking at. And then there are zillions of imbalances that will come up, that long list of what you put down there. One of the big things is prescription drugs. It's so interesting that just because you get it from a doctor doesn't make it any less addictive. So
no, yeah, exactly.
Whatever when we're in discomfort, we're gonna do something to avoid that. Again, we avoid pain, and that then turns into an addiction. So for us, really, it doesn't matter what the external ramification, what the external expression of the addiction is. What we are looking at is the underlying things that are going on, the root cause.
So that leads to my next question, which is, I rarely see people with one addiction. They almost always come in groups. Have you ever observed patterns that the heroin addict has typically got an addiction to X, or the workaholic has got also a correlating addiction to Y?
Well, if we look at, very rarely is addiction a standalone thing, because they'll imbalance creates more imbalance. So what we see a lot is, hey, an alcohol guy is going to have depression, and that where do these other than mental diagnoses come in? So really, everybody's got an addiction to their belief system. So that's
we're going to get into that. That's coming up.
That's where it all starts. So we all share that addiction in common. Hey, what I think to be true, I'm pretty committed to that. And hey, that's there's a lot of reasons for that. That's what keeps me safe. That's what allows me to navigate in the world. And that's why people get so upset when we talk about things that are controversial. That's why they say, hey, don't talk about religion or politics at party, because that gets people fired up because it challenges their belief system. And so most people have more than one thing going on.
I tell people all the time, if your belief system's worth living, it's worth challenging.
Well, I like that. And what's so interesting about our belief system? We get so connected to being right, or that my beliefs are in fact valid. And all of our beliefs are going to go by way of one of two things are going to happen. We're either going to get rid of them and replace them with a better belief as we learn something new. So if we look at, hey, the earth used to be flat and now somebody took a picture from space or whatever, boy, that's my new belief. That makes sense to me. So I'm going to discard my old belief. Or my belief is going to evolve into a higher order of itself. So I think about love in that way. Hey, what I think and hold true about love now, I'm hoping next year will be greater than what I'm holding right now. So it will evolve into a greater expression of itself. So it's so interesting why we are so convicted in holding on to our beliefs, because they're only going to change anyway. Right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we haven't done yet, which I'd like to do with you, is define what an addiction is. And I've got a couple of definitions I wanted to share. One's from the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and they define an addiction as follows. Addiction is a primary chronic disease. I just ate breakfast and it's bouncing up here as I'm talking. Addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected in individual pathology pursuing reward and relief or relief by substance and or other behaviors. Another addiction I got out of one of my favorite books, which we'll talk about in a bit. Addiction is a pathological relationship to any mood-altering person, thing, or substance or activity that has life-damaging consequences. I personally define addiction as any repeated behavior that does not produce the results you want and ultimately limits freedom. I'm wondering if you have a definition that you work with.
Well, in its simplest form, addiction is where I'm doing something that I don't want to do, regardless of the outcome. So I think it's a synthesis of all of those things. I think your first definition, sounds very technical. At the end of the day, really, an addiction is an imbalance where I am doing something and it's got a cost it's exacting a high price in my life.
Thus limiting freedom.
Yeah, and I think though on the other side, what it occurred to me one day because I was giving a talk and I looked up these definitions of addiction, and I'm at an addiction conference. But I actually think that addiction can be looked at as also a wake up call because so many times in our lives, we can rationalize our way out of a lot of our highest good by saying things like, hey, when the kids are off in college, then I'll go and do this thing. When my IRA is funded, then I'll do this. When this happens, then I'll leave this toxic relationship. So I can rationalize my way out of having to make hard decisions in the moment. But when you have a good addiction, it's coming for you. And so you're going to have to reconcile this thing one way or another. And in my opinion, there's only three ways out of a juicy addiction. And one is that it's going to take you down, whether that's all at once, hey, I have an accident and I lose my life, or whether it's a slow, painful process. People that die of alcoholism, that's a very challenging way to die. And it's a slow death, or I overcome the thing.
Yes.
And or I can stay in recovery. So I guess there's another way in there. I can stay in that recovery model and continue to kind of manage my externals, and that works for some people. But I think in the model that we're using is, hey, I want to get the lesson out of this thing and transcend it. And that's what I've done in my own life. I don't consider myself an addict, which is an interesting thing. If I walked into any prominent treatment center with my files, and
you'd be an addict.
I would be an addict. I have 2 banker boxes of files. I kept every file that I ever got from treatment. So I have 2 of them packed full, 30 years worth of addiction stuff. And if I walked into one of those centers and I plunked them down on the desk and I said, I'm not an addict, they would look at me and say, oh my God, you are a sick man. You're in denial. But I can tell you, it doesn't inform me. It doesn't live in me. I've grown a body that I'm not motivated by it. And interestingly enough, this is how I spend all day, every day. And I still don't think about it in that way. So
yeah,
for me, addiction was a big wake-up call that my life needed to take another turn, that there was something more for me.
Yes, well, your 3 approaches there correlate quite beautifully with what I teach when I'm teaching my students or my patients that are having relationship problems to persons, places, or things, about the 4 things you can do when there's a relationship problem, because an addiction is a relationship. You have a relationship with alcohol, or a relationship with work, or a relationship with pornography. Whenever there's a subject-object relationship, there is a relationship. And the 4 things that I tell people you can do with a relationship problem is, number 1, work on yourself. 2, work on the relationship. 3, do nothing, and yesterday equals tomorrow. And 4, get out of the relationship. So it correlates quite nicely with the 3 things you just mentioned.
Yeah.
In my work, I specialize. I really built my reputation by dealing with medical failures. When I got out of the 82nd Airborne Division and came here to California to do my work, I got licensed as a sports massage therapist. Then I got licensed as a holistic health practitioner, which is really the license that I operate under today, which in California means you can use any holistic or natural means to help people with anything, which I like that because it's quite a loose, license. It gives me a lot of latitude. But I've become successful by using the knowledge I gained as a mechanic and working with hydraulic systems. I repaired weapon systems in Cobra helicopters, so I had a deep study of electronics, but I learned how to analyze systems. And I grew up on a farm, which is a bunch of different systems interacting with each other. And so I made the habit, I would get people that would come to me that, had seen 15, 20, 30 doctors, multiple surgeries. And I noticed right away that, they've seen 10 neurologists. We don't need to go down that route. Or they've seen 10 chiropractors. It's probably not that. So I developed a system of looking at how systems interact and what's causing what. And when I started analyzing people's belief systems, I almost always would be led back to some belief about what God wants or what God expects. And a lot of the patients that I was working with were claimed atheist or agnostic. And I had to remind them, you're in a Christian culture. All you got to do is look at the names of the roads, the holidays, the legal system. You can track almost all of this back to religious programming. And I've actually got a couple of books, but one of my favorites is a book titled When God Becomes a Drug, and it's about God as an addiction. And it's a study of people's beliefs and basically how so much of the beliefs that we actually are acting out consciously or unconsciously relate to religious programming. And I remember my mother was a Christian Scientist before she became a yogi. And I remember being a kid sitting in Sunday school, hearing about how God is love, but then singing Onward Christian Soldiers Marching Off to War with the cross of Jesus going on before. And I found it very, very scary, and constantly being told I would burn in hell if I touched my genitals or did this or did that, yet being told God was love. And it really was disconcerting. And it actually left me as a child thinking, I'm scared, because if adults can't see this, and whenever I'd ask these kinds of questions, I would just get shut right down. I wouldn't get an answer. I would just get reprimanded. And so when my mother became a member of the Self-Realization Fellowship and I was able to talk to the monks, I always got beautiful answers. And I remember a profound experience. The first time I went to a Self-Realization Fellowship temple, the first thing they did was begin the ceremony with a prayer. And the prayer started off with, Jesus Christ, Paramahansa Yogananda, Sri Yukteswar, Lahiri Mahashai, Babaji, saints and sages of all religions, we humbly bow to you all. And the instant I heard those words, it had a very powerful healing effect on me, because I realized I was now in a place that had consideration of all the different belief systems, concepts, and ideas in the world, but wasn't necessarily trying to force you into a given box. So with that preamble, I'm wondering, what have you seen when it comes to beliefs about God and religious programming as a source of addictions in general?
Well, I think if we look at, and you've hit some solid points. A lot of people think that just because I don't practice religion, that somehow I'm outside of that model. And so we have to look at the mythology of our Western world compared to the mythology of everywhere else on the planet, the more traditional societies, the wisdom traditions. And so if we look at, we go back to the original story of Adam and Eve, and hey, Adam and Eve are in the garden. Everything is great, right? Life just can't be any better than this. God says, look, you guys do whatever you want. Just don't go over there and eat from the tree of knowledge. And hey, now any parent that has a child that knows that, hey, if you tell your child, you know what, you have the whole house to yourself, just don't look in that closet over there.
You know what's going to happen next.
You know what's going to happen, right? So it's a little bit of a setup. We were sort of set up. But anyway, so we eat from the tree. So that's Eve. And so, cursed be the earth because of you, woman.
And women.
Right, woman. And so now we have an aggressive relationship with the feminine, which includes the earth. because the earth is feminine. And
Yes.
we look at women throughout the history since the last couple of thousand years, the feminine hasn't fared so well. And so then, we've been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, basically born in sin. We're born uh, dis, dis, we're born tarnished in some way. We're not good enough. And I think that permeates us. One of our core wounds that we've identified is this thing of there's something wrong with me. And I think that when we look at people, when they really get honest down deep, there's a lot of people that feel defective in some way. Hey, I'm not good enough. We compare ourselves with people on TV and supermodels and all that kind of stuff. And so I think like inherently there's something wrong. I'm not good enough. And that comes right from that myth. I'm kicked out of the garden. You know what? You really messed up, and therefore, hey, you're out. You have sinned. You have messed up, and there's nothing you're going to do about it. And so we look at that. So I think that religion, again, it sure has affected us. All thing, and I don't want to villainize religion in particular, but if we look at any kind of institution that is, that is very strict, inherently it's going to be limiting in some ways. And
yes.
So, and hey, I don't have a strong connection to, I've studied religion worldwide. I don't practice a specific religion, but I find it hard to believe that Jesus Christ would come down and cast the Dalai Lama off to hell because he didn't necessarily believe in the same paradigm as people that are Christians. I'm not saying that any is better or worse, so I like to avoid that particular standpoint, but I think we're all trying to get to the same place. And if we would stop making the other, stop othering people like they're different than me. Hey, all these religions are looking for one thing, and that's connection, right? And that's love. And whether they're successful or not, I think, any institution that reaches a certain size has to spend a lot of its energy maintaining itself. And that's just the nature of institutions. It's all institutions fall in that category. So when that begins to happen, then there's a price to pay. And I think that has influenced us, again, most of the time unconsciously. It's interesting. We've had plenty of people that have had direct trauma as a result of things that have happened in churches and other places. So I think that it is a big influence on our culture right now.
Yes, I have a few comments I'd love to share with you and the listeners because I've spent a lot of my life studying world religion and everything to do with it because my work, as I said, kept bringing me back to this. And I have a saying for my students. If you have a patient with a knee problem, it's important to remember that the knee of someone practicing Hinduism is different than the knee of a Christian, is different than the knee of a Muslim, is different than the knee of a Buddhist. And they look at me and go, well, what do you mean by that? The anatomy is the same. I say, yes, but how and why they're using their knee and what led to the injury isn't the same because all actions are the results of beliefs. Actions are behaviors. So one of the things I found fascinating is Shankara, who was are you familiar with Shankara?
I'm not.
Shankara was a Hindu philosopher sage who at 8 years of age began walking all over India on foot by himself, seeking out spiritual masters and gurus and challenging them to debates, and he never lost a debate. And Shankara said, no man can understand scripture until he's enlightened. And when he's enlightened, he does not need scripture. And the beauty and the truth of that is, as I've shared with many of my students and patients, if you walk into churches and temples all over the world, you will have a very hard time finding anyone in a Sunday school who's programming children that is enlightened. And therefore, you're falling into the trap of personal interpretations of Scripture. And Scripture cannot be easily interpreted at that level. So what you get is a lot of false translations. And to prove this, and I've done this countless times, I've said, okay, who in this classroom is a Christian? And this ranges from audience as big as 500 people. And piles of hands will go up. And then I'll say, okay, which of you can tell me the actual meaning of the words Adam and Eve? So far, not one single person has ever been able to tell me what those words actually mean. So I have to share with them. Adam means creature of the earth. In Arabic, it means creature of the earth, of earthly slime. And Eve means life force. I say, do you guys realize that that means exactly the same thing as yin and yang in Taoist speak? Yin, the feminine, Eve, yang, the masculine, that which is expressed, or in David Bohm's model, the explicate relative to the implicate. And it means that this is the very creative forces of life. And to help people through this, I often get Christians in my classes that'll start going at me like preachers and quoting Bible passages. So I highlight to them that there's 4 levels of scriptural interpretation, which I spent years studying Houston Smith's work, and this is where I learned this from. The 4 levels of interpreting scripture are: number 1, which is the lowest quality of interpretation, is literal. Number 2 is ethical, which means my group's belief against your group's belief. Thus, you have the concept of the chosen ones. Number 3, so getting close to the best, is allegorical, which means when you're reading scripture, it's telling you a story that points to a meaning that may not actually be in the words, just like reading poetry. But you have to have a fair bit of brain power to understand allegory and poetry. And most people are too programmed to actually see deep enough into scripture. But interestingly, the highest level of scriptural interpretation is inspirational. So when we have truly wise people teaching scripture, scripture is a means of inspiring people to live and love more fully. But over and over again, repeatedly, almost like clockwork, when I work with people that have addictions, I see belief systems that are based on literal and ethical interpretations of scripture that pit them against themselves and against other people. And the pain of that usually can't be attenuated in the family because the family carries the same belief system and the same kinds of pain. So it's kind of like going to a drug addict for drug addiction counseling. It never works. So, these things are very, very real. And unfortunately, a lot of my students don't like the fact that I get into religion. But I say, look, my job and your job, if you're here as a student of mine, is to identify the etiology of what's driving a person's behaviors that are ultimately leading to imbalances in those 4 doctors and the 6 foundation principles that I teach, which are nutrition, hydration, sleep, breathing, thinking, and moving. And when you look at the psyche, you can't separate thoughts, feelings, and emotions from the body. The psyche is a rainbow bridge that goes from the transcendent, unknowable called God at the top to matter at the bottom, and every part of it's interacting with every other part of it. And I explain to them, it's your beliefs that make you eat or not eat, exercise or not exercise. It's your beliefs and your emotions that determine how you breathe and how you move and when you move and how much you move. So if we avoid the concept of religious programming, when research shows 85% of the world population claims religious affiliation, then we're ignoring the fact that our culture is indoctrinated into what I call corporate religion, which is what you were referring to, industrialized religion. But I also tell people I have nothing against religion. The word itself means religio, which means to link back or to reconnect. And ultimately, we're at a time now in the evolution of humanity, if we don't connect to each other, we're going to simply destroy the planet and each other. So I think these are things that really are important to not only addiction, but any kind of chronic illness or injury that keeps happening, because what they are, they're expressions of beliefs and behaviors. But moving to my next question, and thanks for sharing your viewpoints on that. Are you familiar with Angeles Arian?
No, I'm not.
Oh man, you would love her work. For anyone that's not familiar with her, she recently died. She was an anthropologist and a shaman who was just incredibly tapped in, truly enlightened. There's a radio show that's been around forever. I don't even know if it's still running, called New Dimensions Radio, and the host is Peter Toms. But if you search New Dimensions Radio and then go on their site and search Angeles Arian, you'll find at least 3 interviews, which I think you'll find fascinating. But Angeles Arrien was an anthropologist and shaman, and she traveled all over the world. But I can't remember, it was either 60 or 100 different countries and cultures all over the world she visited, specifically trying to identify what were the root causes of addiction. And after many, many years of research, she synthesized it down to the 4 causes, which are not in any hierarchical order. She found that intensity, which means a person who's raised in an intense environment, perfectionism, the need to know, and focusing on what's wrong were ultimately the 4 things that triggered most addictions. I'm just curious what your thoughts on that are.
Well, I would tend to agree. If we just kind of break these things out, hey, intensity, that's the driver of memory. So things that are intense, if we think about, hey, where was everybody during 9/11? Most people remember where they were because it was a very emotionally charged, very intense experience. So those things tend to land deeper for us. And
yes,
the perfectionism piece, it's interesting. We see a lot of that, and that sets up this dynamic where, hey, a lot of people can forgive other people. People are in group or whatever, and hey, I can forgive everybody around me, but I can't forgive myself, right? That means I'm holding myself to a different standard that I'm holding the rest of the population of Earth for, and so I don't give myself. I'm not allowing myself to be human, and kind of all the messiness of being human. Somehow I'm not allowing that for myself, and of course that's a recipe for disaster. Need to know what is this thing, that keeps us safe, but there are so many things that are unknowable. That actually, the need to know precludes us from the great mystery. It precludes us from God. This word, all these religions, everybody trying to know God better. Well, God is unknowable.
Amen.
And so, but I can experience it though. I can't know it, but I can have an experience of it. And so my need to know is going to limit that very thing that I'm looking for. And of course, focusing on what's wrong, hey, anything that, whatever you put your attention, that's where your energy goes. So the more I'm focusing on what's wrong, the more I'm going to drive things that are wrong and find things that are wrong. So I would tend to agree with those things. The way I looked at it was a little bit different. And I looked at basically people come here to the sanctuary with all kinds of diagnoses, everything under the sun. Most people that come here have a plethora of diagnoses to their credit. And they become drivers of belief, of course, and self-fulfilling prophecies. But underneath those, we came up with 5 things that tend to go wrong with people. And probably the granddaddy of them all is separation. And that means that somehow, God has forsaken me. I'm different. I don't belong. That can show up in a lot of different ways. But somehow, this whole organizing principles of the universe apply to everybody but me. And so I feel excluded in some way. Unworthy. There's something wrong with me. Inherently, I'm defective in some way. I've been abused. Hey, abuse, abandonment, betrayal, trust. Those are wounds that we've seen that tend to be like these archetypal wounds that we all hold in some way. So I think that that's just how I've looked at it in this more archetypal wound, and it seems in just our sharing, invariably when people come, they are talking about their addiction or whatever got them here. But then as we start to get down to the underlying beliefs or the underlying causes, the underlying, I guess these wouldn't be causes. These are more like embodiments of what's wrong. We always come to this handful of things that we all share.
Yes. I'm curious, having been to a number of different cultures yourself, have you found that different cultures have different approaches to addiction than we do in the Western culture?
Well, it's, yeah, and if we look at the way people look at life all around the world is typically a reflection of then how they would look at addiction. So there are typically Western cultures, modernized cultures look at addictions the same way that we do, and more indigenous or wisdom traditions look at addiction as an imbalance, something, it's soul sickening. There's something, it's calling me to look at something in my life. And so if we can generalize it kind of in that way.
Yeah. Now, we've been talking and using words that are commonly traded, but without a clear understanding of what they mean. I'm curious, you've highlighted a little bit what your concept of soul was. What is your definition of mind and spirit?
Well, the mind is different than the brain. So, the mind, and what I mean by that is we look at, hey, where does an idea come from? And I've had this experience, as I'm sure many of our listeners have. I'll be noodling around on something, really working out an idea. I'll go to a conference and I'll hear a speaker talking about it, and I'll say, that was my idea. And then I wonder, well, wait a second, was that his idea and I was just kind of tapped into it? Or did this thing exist somewhere else and we're both kind of tapped into it? So the mind is this kind of greater thing. The brain actually is this antenna to the mind.
Yes.
And for us, what we're really concerned about is the unconscious brain, that the limbic brain, that part of us where all of our unprocessed hurts, wounds, beliefs, all of our stuff lurks. And this is where the program is, because it's all unconscious. And so that's where, for us, that's where we're looking at in the mind, this unconscious place. And spirit, it's interesting. If when I look at spirit, I think about spirit as the totality of everything. And the totality of everything, the underpinning of everything is energy. So everything is energy, and we actually have an energy body. And the way we can understand that is, Paul, many of us are old enough to have driven underneath high voltage power lines when we were younger and get static on our radio.
Yes.
Happens too much in the digital age now, but what's happening there, that phenomenon is, hey, electricity going down a line creates a field around it, and everything that's in the field is influenced by the field. Well, every nerve in your body is electrically generated, so your spinal column becomes this high voltage power cable, and we have this field of energy around us, and that field is interacting with a larger field, and this is how we get a lot of our signals from the universe. So spirit, I'm the way I personally look at it, it's a pretty big topic, is the whole totality of the information of the universe. My spirit is my personal antenna, my energy body to connect to that, because most of that information is coming in unconsciously through this antenna. So the quality of that antenna, it's just like, hey, if I have a really pure signal, I have a very, very clear music or whatever I'm listening to. If my antenna is rusty, then hey, my signal is not going to be so clear. I get a little static on the radio, and we have this personal spirit or personal energy body, and that is affected by our nervous system, which of course is affected by trauma and drug use. So most of the time, when people are walking in the door, their antenna to spirit is not functioning to capacity. So therefore, it's kind of like looking through a window that's dirty. Hey, I can still see what's going on out there, but I'm not privy to all the different nuances of all the colors and all the experiences. And so I think of our energy body the same way.
Yeah, it's the metaphorical strawberry milkshake in the keyboard of your genetic piano.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah, there's, because these are such elusive words, I've spent a lot of time investigating them. I love the alchemy, the expression of alchemy. They, define soul as the receptive and spirit as the flow of energy and information. And one of the analogies I read in one of my alchemy books, which was quite neat, is they talked about in the old days when they used to use wax seals, like if the king or a prince or royalty was sending an envelope, it had a very unique wax seal, and they could tell that the envelope had been opened because the seal was broken, and you can't reheat it because it destroys the imprint. So they describe spirit as the information, the symbol, and the soul as the wax that receives it. So I really help people understand just by saying spirit is the flow of energy and information, which everything in the universe that we can experience is a flow of energy and information. And I define soul as consciousness within. It's what's inside of you that's aware and having the experience of making love or the taste of your food or the joy of breathing. But what your perception of that experience is and what's available to you in the environment is the flow of spirit. So those are just a couple of different ways that I share. One of the things that I've observed in my career and having studied shamanism extensively, the shaman often say that the more traumatized a person is, the more potent their healing power is when they heal, because all the energy that they've had entangled in their wounds and their complexes becomes free energy that they can now use to help other people with. I'm wondering if you've seen cases where, well, you're a living example of it, but have you observed that when people that have a lot of trauma actually heal, that they have more potential to be powerful healers?
Yes, we have. A big part of our process here is that we turn our wounds into wisdom. And I think that's the hero's journey. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Yes.
And that quote that you just, that in the shamanic view, it's like, hey, our deepest, darkest things are the key to what are going to be our greatest attributes. So it's interesting for me in my journey. Hey, 30 years worth of addiction, 20 years in treatment, and I have pain and suffering stories like you would not believe. I don't think about any of that. One day I'm in a treatment center and I'm thinking to myself, none of this is working, and I'm not the only one that this isn't working for. And then all of a sudden I realize, wait a second. All of this has been my training. I know more about this topic than any counselor I've sat in front of, because I've been all over the world and I paid attention to every moment in treatment because I wanted to get better. And when that landed, I'm like, that was my training. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go create a treatment center. And when that something shifted in me, and I have not ever really told the war story. As so many times we've all been at 12-step meetings, and we hear people that are sober for a long time, and, blessings, no judgment about whatever anybody's doing. But I thought about, well, when do we stop telling these war stories? When am I done being defined by my past?
Yes.
When we can then take the past, get the medicine from the past, that's going to then fuel who I'm becoming. So I don't consider myself a guy with all these, and this is the kind of the psychological approach. It's like this, and this happened, and this is why I am the way I am today. Hey, there's some validity to that. But what we want to know is, hey, who am I becoming?
Yes.
Who are Paul and Dean today? Hey, we're reinventing ourselves, right? And what are we going to use? We're going to use the power from our past, not our wounded story, but our wisdom story. So
yes.
I think that is the keyest part of actually being recovered, moving from recovery to being recovered, is by taking the medicine of all of those traumatic experiences. And hey, what did you learn? That's your unique life path. It's like going to Harvard. Hey, what's your particular curriculum? Well, you're soul incarnated. Your life path is your particular curriculum. If we don't get the lesson, the teacher's going to keep coming. So let's get the lesson, and then the teacher doesn't have to keep coming. We'll invite in a whole bunch of new lessons. And I think that's what you were just referring to in what you.
Yes. And I think I look at my own life, and I've had a chance now to hear more about yours, which I really appreciate. And what I've found is that as traumatic as a life can be, and as painful as a life can be, and we know there's plenty of trauma and pain in most families, what I've found through my own life and observing, 35 years of patients that I've worked with, is that if we actually get to a point where we're able to listen and observe the guidance that's around us, whether it be, a book falling off a shelf, or a friend saying, hey, I tried this approach and it really helped, or a dream that informs us, or a friend of ours saying, hey, I'm going off to the jungle to do a shamanic ceremony with ayahuasca. Do you want to join me? That ultimately we can reach the place where we realize that the universe or the world, if you want, is actually guiding us towards our own resolution. But it's really just a matter of getting to the point in our life where we have the presence, the awareness, and the receptivity to sort of see where the pain teacher is pointing us. And instead of numbing it out, follow the cookie trail. And then we ultimately get to the point, like both you and I have, where everything that once was confusing and seemingly meaningless turns out to be exactly the experience we needed to become the person we are and enter the world of being an elder to guide other people. I'm wondering if you've seen that pattern.
Have. So have. And that's when, there's so much wisdom. And what's interesting is that the universe wants balance. If we look at everything comes to homeostasis eventually. And that's what the universe is supporting us to do. And it's a great journey. This, as I shared earlier, and I think you have too, addiction is such a great catalyst because you have to face it. And suffering can be that way too. Unfortunately, and you had shared a little about this in the early part of our discussion, unfortunately, a lot of change has to come through suffering. And hopefully we get to the point where that's not the case anymore. And a lot of times that suffering, people will then go through the normal channels, whatever the normal channel, the more conventional channels, the doctor, the therapist, the treatment center, and then they'll start to open up to these more esoteric models, which have been around forever. And this very thing that you're talking about, kind of getting down to our deepest core self and figuring out who we are and how we walk in the world is going to be important for anybody that's connected to their soul. And
yes,
addiction.
I agree. And I often quote Edward Edinger, a famous psychiatrist and Jungian analyst whose work I've studied quite a bit. His definition of consciousness is quite potent. He says, consciousness is a psychic substance produced not blindly, but in living awareness of opposites. And I think ultimately what I call the pain teacher and what you're referring to as suffering is what's offering us living awareness. And the opposites are the choices that we have, more or less, do, don't do, yes, no, inside, outside, inhale, exhale. I mean, everything's that operating on those complementary opposites. And so I think that when we realize that the more conscious we are, the more options we have for freedom. But to be conscious requires that we're aware. And when we're unconscious, then inevitably we bang into life. We bang into people and relationships. We bang into, substance abuse or exercise abuse or, any number of things. So, I think most people are unaware that pain has a very, very valuable function in that it enhances conscious awareness. And that's one of the reasons I get so concerned with this allopathic approach to just drugging the hell out of things.
Yeah, I understand.
I think I read on your website that you didn't believe in chemical addiction. Is that correct?
Well, I think if when I'm in the throes of something, yes, I drink enough alcohol, my body adapts to it, I'm chemically addicted. Now, I take the alcohol away for 10 years, I can't claim to be chemically addicted then. I take the drink and yet I'm right back to it again. So I don't know that I can put that on a chemical addiction because during that time, my cells have reoriented towards their normal environment. And so we can't blame anything on that. But when somebody has, a heavy dose of anything going on, including emotions, hey, I'm going to get addicted to that. I mean, my body's used to it. And that's called an addiction. And so to that extent, I do believe in it that way. But I don't believe that hey, once an addict, always an addict, because we would be addicted to every emotion that lingered around. And, many people have fallen in love, but aren't necessarily addicted to love. So there's just a way that we synthesize and navigate through that. So I think that in terms of the long-term impact of addiction on people, I don't know that it's a chemical thing.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. And the other level, too, to that is I've done a lot of research into psychedelics, which are classically not physically addictive, but I found that they can be psychologically addictive. For example, I see a lot of people running off into the jungle, into so-called shaman, to get really some kind of an escape from the realization that the choices that they're making and the way they're living is what's causing their problem. But while they're in a ceremony, they somehow seem to be alleviated of all that, unless, of course, you get a nice tour of the shadow. But my point being is that some things are not chemically addictive, but they're psychologically addictive based on the relationship that we have with them.
Yeah, agreed. I think everybody's looking for the panacea, and everybody's looking for the easy way out. Everybody's kind of looking, and we're all, or I shouldn't say we're all of anything, but many people are looking external to them. And as you know, Paul, it's not external. Psychedelics are great because they can help us to open up, but they're a tool. They're not the end. They're a tool to get to the end. There's no getting out of the work. And
no, I always tell people the psychedelics will show you where the door to healing is, but they won't pick you up and make you walk through it. That's your job.
Yeah.
I would love it if you could just tell us what, in your observation, some of the telltale signs of addiction are.
Well, I think, when people are any kind of change in behavior. So let's look at that. I think that when people's sleep patterns are different, when somehow there's a change, when people are not themselves, if we're looking at family members, of course, family members want to give the other member the benefit of the doubt. And I think this is where my suggestion is tap into your own intuition and trust what you're feeling. And yes, there's always a strange circumstance that emerges here and there that, just weird things happen to people, and that's explainable. But a consistent things that if it appears to be wrong, then most likely it is wrong. But I think if we look at people that are all of a sudden now changing their habits in terms of their comings and goings, their habits in terms of money, their habits in terms of sleeping, their habits in terms of their irritability or their just the way they're navigating the world, these are all signs that something is going on. And it doesn't, of course, has to be an addiction. It could be something else that's bothering them. But I think for family members and for loved ones, it's really important to trust your intuition because you know these people and you know what's going on. And it's easy to get talked out of it because we want so desperately to believe them, right? We love them. We care about them. We want them to be successful and we want to believe them. But that would be my advice.
Yes. Well, if you were leaving the earth tomorrow, what words of wisdom would you like to share with the people of the world before you go?
Well, if I was leaving the world, and I almost did that, and I shared this little story, as I was getting to the end of my life, and, I just didn't have any more energy, 20 years of treatment. Where am I going to go? I've tried everything under the sun. I've got very little life force. It's coming. And I wasn't concerned about losing my family or my bucket list that I didn't do. What bothered me most, Paul, is that I didn't fulfill my mission. I didn't do what I came to this world to do, and I didn't even know what it was, but it bothered me. So my advice for people, if I was leaving in the world, is don't wait. You have something to do. You have some unique offering, whatever that is. Maybe that's raising your child in a certain way. Maybe that's, planting a garden in the way that you want to. Whatever your soul song is, don't wait to sing it because it's our regrets that get us. It's not all the things, when people are on their deathbed, rarely do you hear them say, I should have never quit my job and joined the Merchant Marines. I should have never done that. I should have never, eloped and ran off to Vegas to marry my sweetheart. People often lament what they didn't do. Yes. And so I would say don't wait because inside of every single person, because we are all unique and everybody, there's no two people with the same energetic signature on this planet right now. And there's no two people except for identical twins or twins that have the same genetic signature. So there's something special about you and offer it to the world. And in doing that, you'll have participated in evolution and done your job as a human being on this planet. That's what I would.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm grateful for this time with you. And I looked into the sanctuary quite a lot, and as I wrote you in an email, it's exactly the kind of place I'd love to be, and not because I have an addiction, but I really love what you put together there.
Wow.
I'm in the process of looking for land to create my own sanctuary, so to speak, to do the work that I do. And I was just really impressed with the beauty and the harmony and the energy of your place. So I give you a big congratulations on what you've created for people there.
Well, thanks.
Where can people find more about you, your work in the sanctuary?
Well, go right to sanctuary.net, www.sanctuary.net. There's a lot of videos, a lot of things. We kind of put our hearts on our sleeves out there. That's everything we know and everything we think. We'll share it with you. And so, this is all about making the world a better place. So I'd also invite you, Paul, if you're ever around Sedona and you want to stop by, we have the best food on planet Earth. So if you get here at noon or 6, we'll feed you.
I'm going to come see you for sure. My friend Aubrey Marcus has a ranch in Sedona. So last I was there, I was out visiting him. But now that I know you're there, I'm going to consider I have a new friend and I got to come check you out.
That would be a big honor for us, Paul. Really would appreciate it. And on that note, really appreciate all that you're doing in the world. And thanks for bringing forth everything that you're doing.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this interview, and Penny will share more about where to find Dean in a second here. So thanks all of you, and share the love, and pay attention to everything we've shared so you can use the challenges in your life to create opportunities, and get your head down in your heart and let that be your compass and be the unique expression of yourself that you came to the world to be. Lots of love. Aho, Great Spirit.
Aho.
Thank you for listening to Living 4D with Paul Chek and today's guest, Dean Taraborelli. You can find more about the Sanctuary online at sanctuary.net or on Facebook at The Sanctuary at Sedona. Dean has a complimentary ebook for Living 4D with Paul Chek listeners, Be Recovered, Transformational Healing Through Integrative Addictive Recovery. Grab your copy today at sanctuary.net/be-recovered-e-book. Follow Paul on Instagram and Twitter at Living4D Podcast or on his YouTube podcast channel, youtube.com/Living4D with Paul Chek. You can watch more on Paul's blog at paulcheksblog.com and the Czech Institute's blog at czekinstitute.com/blog.